I don't think what people need necessarily is just more content. And that's sometimes the danger of the church, is just sort of delivering them yet another video or podcast or whatever. I mean, I create that stuff, so in a sense, I'm the worst offender here. But the
Same.
I suppose what the church needs to do is to remind people of the depth that's there. What we're really overwhelmed with now is a lot of shallow media.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast. I'm so glad you're watching today. Hey, if you're new here, you're in for a treat. We've got Justin Brierley, and believe it or not, apologetics is getting better. We're going to talk all about it. There's a spiritual openness, and also there's a new approach to apologetics and a collapse from the new atheism that you need to know about. So if you enjoy this episode, make sure you subscribe, like the episode, and then maybe leave a comment. Let us know what you think. And we'll be right into the interview after a word from today's sponsors. This episode is brought to you by the Art of Leadership Live. Hey, if you're looking to level up your leadership and take your church to the next level, in September, I'm hosting the Art of Leadership, a live event in Dallas, Texas. We're going to spend 3 transformative days together. And in it, you and I are going to do a deep dive into your spiritual and emotional health as a leader. We'll talk about strategies for church growth, and we're going to create a healthier future for you and the people you lead. And we're going to do it in community. This is not just another conference where you just sit and listen for 8 to 10 hours a day. We've all been to too many of those. It's super interactive, deeply practical, and you're going to meet some incredible leaders. It's a perfect mix of teaching, connection, and free time. You'll have space to learn, process, and create a plan together on what matters most to you. So let me just say this. Last year, I was absolutely blown away by the quality of the leaders in the room who came to the first ever event. We had so many unfiltered conversations, and you know what? It's a social media free zone, so you can really talk. I'm very excited to do it again in September. So right now, we have super early bird pricing. It's available for only a couple more weeks, so don't wait. Visit theartofleadershiplive.com to grab your spot today. That is theartofleadershiplive.com. Be sure to get your application in before March 21st to secure your ticket at the best rate. On a final note, if you are already an all-access member in the Art of Leadership Academy and you want to attend, guess what? You're already approved. Everybody else has to apply, but you can get in at an exclusive member rate. Just sign into your account to learn more and get the special registration link. This episode is brought to you by Subsplash. You know, for a lot of congregations, consistent giving can be a challenge, not because people aren't willing to give, but because doing so requires a strong system in place. So Subsplash Giving helps remove every possible barrier to partnering with your church's mission. Your donors can give in your app, they can give on your website via SMS text, and even they can give during live streams. Plus, with Apple Pay, Google Pay, and Instant ACH, your people can complete a donation in seconds. Subsplash also partners with InGiven to make it easier than ever to process and manage stock and crypto donations. So join the thousands of churches maximizing their ministry impact with Subsplash Giving, thanks to industry-leading rates and 0 monthly fees. To learn more, go to subsplash.com/Carey. You can schedule a quick, no-obligation demo and save 30% on your platform subscription. And you can set that all up when you sign up with Subsplash as your exclusive giving provider. Justin, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on for the first time.
Oh, thank you for having me, Carey. It's great to be with you.
Well, I'm going to start with, the burning question that was on everyone's mind when they woke up this morning, which is Christianity kind of died in Europe and the UK in the 19th century, right? Nobody thinks about that, but I do have a degree in history. And I think it maybe is going to be helpful for us to discussing what we want to talk about, the surprising rebirth of curiosity and faith. But I think often history is our friend. So, as a European, as a Brit, I would love for you, and as a student of this thing, to take us back a couple of centuries. What happened in the 19th century to set the stage for the decline of the Christian faith? And for those listeners who are like, why would you start with that? Most of my listeners are American. It's because, Tim Keller made the argument before he died as well. What's happened in the 19th century or 20th century to the mainline church is happening to the evangelical church in the 21st century. But I think you could extend that and say, and also what happened to the European and UK church in the 19th century happened in America in the 20th is happening to evangelicals in the 21st.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. And it's an odd thing to say that Christianity died or began dying in the 19th century, because arguably the Victorian era was the high point of church going in some ways in the UK. And yet at the same time, I think the seeds were there for what became, 150 years later, the sort of the tiny numbers really who now attend in comparison in the UK. And we're seeing the same, as you say, in the West. I actually begin my book and podcast series with a quote from that well-known poem Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, the Victorian poet, which talks about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. And that was, of course, written sort of, in the 1860s. And so it was very much a time even then when the poets and thinkers were seeing, I think, that faith was withdrawing to be replaced by something else, arguably science, technology. This was, an era of huge technological progress. You had the Isambard Kingdom Brunels, constructing railways and bridges. You had modern temples, really, to science, natural history museums going up all over the UK. And if you go to one, say, Oxford's Natural History Museum, it really is designed as a church. You could walk in and it's essentially designed as a Gothic church. But of course, its object of worship is science. And that was really the direction, I think, that everything was going in that era. And so whether it was stated explicitly or not, I think there was that sense in which religion and the kind of de facto place that Christianity had in the West began to be questioned in all kinds of ways. And that was simply happening at the time, though arguably this was coming downstream, obviously, of the Enlightenment a century or two earlier, where you had already started to see reason and science and the rationalists start to essentially replace the ways in which we often knew things or understood the world with a purely rational, analytical approach to life. And that, in a sense, sort of crept into the church in all kinds of ways. And arguably a lot of modern Protestantism brought with it a lot of that Enlightenment thinking and centered the kind of exposition, if you like, logically of the word over the more mystical aspects of sacramental theology and so on that many other church traditions have majored in historically. And so there's a sense in which even the church itself started to play, arguably, by the rules of reason and enlightenment and science and so on. Not that there's anything wrong with those things per se, but I think the issue is that they started to kind of become embedded in culture in a way where, 150 years later, you can have someone like Richard Dawkins sort of almost completely ignore the fact that actually science essentially has Christian origins and simply say, well, we don't need that anymore. We have no need of that hypothesis, Christianity or faith, because we now have science. It's kind of it answers everything. It answers all our questions. And so I think that's what you're seeing in the 19th century, the beginnings of that progression that will eventually lead to what is essentially secular Europe, secular West, secular UK.
Well, this is why I was kind of interested to have the conversation with you because, we do a little bit of history from time to time on the show, but not a ton. And what was interesting to me is exactly where you went with that. Like we talk about the Enlightenment, rationalist thinking, et cetera, et cetera. Elements of that really still define 21st century evangelical thinking, do they not? If so, could you trace out some of that? Like, how would people who maybe don't have the history background, I think the more we understand about our context, the more we understand about our future, potentially.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So how did that play out, like in our lifetime? The rationalist Enlightenment thinking, how has that informed our understanding of Christianity in this generation still?
I think it's come through in all manner of ways. I think, in a sense, secular materialism has, in many ways, become the background hum of a lot of our culture anyway. And so it's come through the academy. And it's therefore, I think, it naturally started to make itself felt in theological sort of, institutions, seminaries and so on. And you inevitably had the growth of the more kind of progressive liberal forms of theology, especially in the late 19th, early 20th century, when people started to take scripture and start to examine it, in in a sense as purely historical data. Now, again, nothing wrong with that in principle, but it's when you start to see Scripture only in that way that you can start to sort of essentially do what some of those, German theologians did when they started to say, well, we just can't really know anything about the history of Jesus, and we just don't know, and so on. So we're going to sort of, as it were, treat this in purely spiritual terms, and we're not, but we're going to doubt ultimately whether we can know anything of the real story and history of Jesus. And that was, that turn, if you like, to that more kind of liberal sort of biblical criticism of the late 19th and early 20th century. It had all kinds of ripple effects, I think, in the wider Protestant church, and it led arguably to what you might call the increasing liberalization of mainline Protestant denominations, whether it be Episcopalians in the US or that wing of the Anglican Church in the UK. And arguably, you've seen that happen across multiple denominations in the West, leading to the point where essentially, I think, a lot of those denominations began to see themselves more as tools for social progress and seeing themselves, if you like, as people there to deliver certain forms of social justice. Again, not that there's anything wrong with social justice, but when it becomes the core defining principle, if you like, of the work you're doing, rather than a kind of real investment in the supernatural belief in Jesus and the gospel and Christianity, when it becomes inverted in that way, I think that's essentially what led to the gradual drift of those denominations and the way in which ultimately they started to lose members, because Christianity became something different to the core it had had up to that point.
Well, I think that's helpful. If you look at the theological left, so to speak, moderate left, you're right. It took from German hired criticism, etc. That whole idea, well, we're not sure about the resurrection. We're not going to take the Bible too literally, but we are all about justice, and we are all about compassion and kindness. So that kind of happened on the left, and it led to the decline of mainline church in the 20th century. I wonder, and feel free to agree, disagree, but on the right, it led to hyper-rationalistic, I will prove to you through the inerrancy of Scripture that creation happened in 6 literal days. I will prove to you, that kind of didactic rationalist thought that was really removed from a charismatic or spiritual experience. Right?
I absolutely agree. Yeah.
So trace that out a little bit, because we're all products of people who came before us, and I think we don't think about that enough.
Well, I think you've put it very well. I think there was this sort of equal and opposite error, arguably, on both sides in the way that they came to embrace a kind of modern assumptions and if you like, that rationalistic approach to Scripture and the Bible. And yes, I mean, I've had many a conversation with N.T. Wright, who's often bangs this drum and says the problem with modernity was that actually a lot of evangelicals, especially in America in the early 20th century, started to trying to kind of fit Scripture and Christianity into this modern mold, essentially trying to use the tools of reason to sort of coerce Scripture into sort of forms of thinking that it wasn't originally designed for in that sense. So as you say, arguably the rise of young earth creationism was an early 20th century phenomenon. It didn't really exist in that form before then. And to that extent, I think that's partly because it is Christians of that era trying to take on these, analytical philosophers, rationalist scientists on their own turf, playing by their rules. And actually, all you end up doing is kind of turning the Bible into something it was never meant to be in the first place. And so I think all of that happened, and it all plays into the reasons why, in many ways, the church started to look rather irrelevant in many parts of culture. Either it looked like it was some sort of conservative reactionary force against science and progress, or it became, as I say, somewhat irrelevant by not appearing to have any real power or anything meaningful to say outside of the normal platitudes of what already existed in society in terms of the social good and so on that it could do. And in many ways, I think it's when the church has often played into the social norms or the fashions of the day that it often has that consequence. What's that famous phrase by G.K. Chesterton? The church that marries the spirit of this age is often made a widow in the next, and I think that's proved to be true.
That's an interesting thing. I hadn't quite framed it that way, but the idea that when you play by their rules, the left played by the rules of progressivism and the higher criticism, et cetera, the right tried to play the rules of rationalism. Apologetics in many ways still follows that mindset
indeed.
that I will empirically prove to you that the Bible is true. And sometimes, it works. People get it. But what are the inherent dangers of adopting a framework that someone else has constructed to try to fit your faith into it?
I mean, I speak really to myself here, Carey, because I am an apologist, and that's really where my faith sort of came alive at an intellectual level was when I discovered apologetics and the rational defense of Christian faith. And I don't want to do it down in the sense that I think that's always been an important part of Christian witness, and you find it there in the New Testament as well. I think the danger is when you see that as somehow the only tool in your toolkit, and that is the only way in which you can access truth and so on. And it can, of course, breed a certain kind of arrogance and can become a form of idolatry in itself when we think that we can essentially arrive at the truth of Christianity and persuade everyone purely through the means of reason and logic and so on. And so for me, that's the great danger. And I've seen many an apologist, as it were, I guess, become too invested in apologetics when inevitably there are all kinds of other things going on when it comes to the reasons people adopt or reject faith. So I think there is that danger. And I think apologetics can sometimes play into that hyper-rationalist, scientistic way of looking at the world and looking at faith. And to that extent, I do want to encourage apologists to be wary of doing that, because too often I think, especially, when the new atheists came along and started to make sort of their claims about science having buried God and that sort of thing, there was quite rightly an important pushback by many churches and apologists wanting to show that was an overreach, that was a misunderstanding of what science and what faith is as well. But at the same time, I think when you try to, as it were, try to prove God, the atheists were essentially saying, I won't believe in God unless you give me some sort of scientific formula or philosophical proof for God. And the problem is if you say, okay, well, I'm going to try and prove God by science, and I'm going to try and prove God by philosophy, you're essentially playing by the rules that they've already set. And that is a problem, because, as I say, the ways in which we actually understand faith and encounter God obviously transcend simply those particular ways. And if we make it appear to our atheist counterpart that this is a valid way of determining the truth of Christianity, then inevitably, I think you're going to be on thin ice, because if the scientific consensus changes, or if they simply find another objection, then they will have thought, well, I've dispensed with that. I have no need of that hypothesis. And I think, and so while I'm not saying don't do apologetics, because for some people it really is important to grapple with the intellectual side of Christianity, and I think there is a long and important history for that, to give someone the impression that that's all that's involved would of course be wrong as well.
What is your approach to apologetics? How would you define it?
Well, I would simply, I suppose, define it the way that the Greek word does, apologia, which is to make a defense of something. And in that sense, all you're being asked to do is what it says in 1 Peter 3:15, which is always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you about the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. And to that extent, apologetics is simply about, when we're asked, being given giving reasons for the faith that we hold. Now, that's frequently in apologetic circles, comes back to philosophy and natural theology, evidences from the universe. And as I say, I think there's a place for those. I think there's a place for saying, when we look outside at the universe, it seems to be pointing beyond itself. And I think that can be a helpful way in for many people who perhaps are more scientifically sort of literate or engaged and so on. But as I say, I wouldn't want it to be the only thing. And the important thing for me with apologetics is to also recognize that it can be as much about the imagination as about, if you like, that very left-brained activity of giving logic and reason. And some of most of the best apologists have actually done both. They've co-opted the right and the left hemispheres of their brain, the imaginative, artistic aspect, to bring light to that scientific and rational enterprise. So C.S. Lewis was masterful at doing this, because he was so good at doing rational apologetics, the problem of pain, mere Christianity. They're classics of intellectual apologetics. But the way he brought it across was also very imaginative in the turns of phrases he used, in the analogies he was able to bring about, and of course through his imaginative fiction as well. The Chronicles of Narnia arguably have done much more than his apologetics works to bring people into an awareness of Christianity. But the apologetics is bubbling away just below the surface if you're reading Narnia. So it's not that he sort of threw it away thinking we must just deal with the imagination. It's the imagination is, if you like, gives people permission to imagine a world in which Christianity is true. And then Lewis is simply saying, well, what if it is true? And I think that's the best approach to apologetics, to not, abandon the imagination, but to infuse our apologetics with it.
That it can be comprehensive, not just one-sided, all logical or otherwise. I would be, before we totally leave history, I always enjoy talking to people from the UK because I spend most of my time in the United States. I live in Canada, and I had someone say to me last week, like, you're from the future because you see what's happening in America because it happened in your country when you were young. And I'm like, yes. And then I talk to Europeans, and it's like, and it happened in your country before I was born. So I'm very interested as sort of this cultural broker, this unique role I get to play. What parallels do you see between what happened in England in the 20th century to, let's just say, church and church attendance, and what's happening in America today? What are you seeing there?
Well, obviously, I see what you see, which is that there is a similar decline going on in the USA as the sort of decline that we saw in the UK, especially sort of from the 60s, 70s onwards. And arguably, that is, in a sense, they often say the USA is just sort of 20 or 30 years behind the curve, if you like, that the UK is part of. Having said that, I think that the situation has been far worse, even in other parts of Europe than the UK. You look at France and other parts of Europe. It's actually that
even the Netherlands, where I have background.
Yeah. And so it's even the UK arguably isn't as far along that secularization journey as other parts of Europe. Why is that? Well, I think that obviously the USA has its own unique history, and I think partly because of the way it was founded, there just has been a much stronger sort of sense of the importance of religion as a kind of front-facing thing, and perhaps that has allowed it to sort of have a certain kind of longevity that hasn't seen it swept aside quite as quickly as it was in many parts of Europe and the UK. I think in a funny way, though, the separation of church and state in the USA sort of helped potentially to stem the decline,
the bleeding,
because actually it can actually be quite a problem. In a funny way, in the UK, I think when people are sometimes exposed to a sort of nominal state type of religion that's kind of just all around them, it can kind of inoculate you against the real thing. When you're given a jab for a disease, you're often given a small amount of the disease to inoculate you against the real thing. And I think sometimes that happens in countries that have got this, state sort of religion. It's because you've received a small dose of it, perhaps in school or wherever. It can actually make you think that you know what it is, and you can basically ignore it or disregard it later on in life. And I wonder sometimes whether that has almost happened in parts of the UK in some respect. That's just a sort of theory of my own in a way. Honestly, though, I think that now we're sort of catching up with each other to some extent, because if you do look at the statistics, especially on the younger end, Gen Z and so on, I think we're heading towards parity almost in both the UK and the USA in terms of the numbers.
If you look at it generationally, it's not that different.
Yeah, it's not that different. What's interesting to me in all of this is that actually there's a lot of other things to tease out in this, though, because just as I would say, sometimes the baggage of institutional religion can actually stop people from accessing the real thing. Sometimes having completely shed that baggage, as we essentially have now, especially here in the UK among Gen Z, very unchurched, people who have really no idea of Bible stories or any kind of were never taken to church as youngsters. Their parents didn't go, their grandparents didn't go. And in a funny way, the statistics now seem to be telling us that generation is the most open, interestingly, even though
almost pre-Christian, right?
Yeah,
they're
exactly.
not reacting against anything.
Yeah. And there's a strange kind of thing, I think, going on to some extent where it's only once you don't have any associations or baggage sometimes that there is sometimes an openness, and that's why the new atheists, people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchins, they were all of that generation who had public school religion sort of thrust upon them, and they rejected it because they didn't want it, and they felt it was suffocating and everything else. Many younger people just have never had that experience, and so, for instance, I spoke recently to people who work with university students across the UK, a Christian organisation, and they're saying they're seeing more openness among non-Christian students than they've ever seen in the last couple of years. And so over 75% of respondents to a survey on whether you would go to church if you were invited to said yes. Again, they had never seen that kind of level of openness among Gen Z students. So I sense that something is actually changing, and there could be a really exciting opportunity there, even as much as we often decry the fact that, Gen Z is the least religious generation. They're actually one of the most open as well. That's obviously going in lots of different, quite esoteric directions.
It's a paradox.
Often.
I'm open, but I'm not running the church. Yeah,
exactly.
So I want to get there a little bit more, but I want to update our little historical conversation and talk about something that's in living memory for a lot of listeners, which is the explosive rise of the new atheism, which was that was like the mid-2000s, wasn't it? It was a fairly recent phenomena. Like even 10, 15 years ago, the new atheists, Dawkins, Hitchins, were all the rage and were thought to be winning the war. We do have a lot of young listeners, so just bring us up on that sort of explosion out of the gate of what is called the new atheism, and then why it seems to have died as quickly as it came. Tell us about that.
Well, in the book and the podcast series, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, I sort of used the tagline for it, why new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. And I think that's, an apt way of putting it, that new atheism was very much this new thing on the block in the mid-2000s. And this was the time when I was just really starting my broadcasting career and starting to host conversations between Christians and non-Christians. So new atheism was this very dogmatic, quite aggressive form of non-belief.
The word was it was evangelical atheism, seeking to convert you.
Absolutely. So whereas perhaps atheism of an older generation had essentially been siloed in more academic, places, and had sort of been tolerant, at least, to the existence of religion in general. This was a much more, as you say, aggressive form of atheism, much more zealous, arguably, and was fronted by some, quite well-known public intellectuals. So there were the so-called four horsemen of new atheism, Richard Dawkins, well-known biologist, Sam Harris over in the US, Daniel Dennett, a philosopher, and Christopher Hitchins, a journalist. And they each had their own best-selling anti-God book that really kind of created a whole new genre of sort of anti-religious literature in the mid-2000s. The best known is Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, which sold millions of copies around the world. And it was fascinating. I think there were probably a few key reasons why it sort of suddenly sprang up at that time. I think it was coming on the heels of 9/11, and a lot of sense among some people that religion was not only false but dangerous. That
was the argument. It was toxic to your health.
Absolutely, yeah. And this was the key thing. I think whereas a previous generation had, essentially said, well, religion is not true. That was, famously Bertrand Russell's book, Why I'm Not a Christian, was essentially him trying to disprove it. This particular generation was saying not only is it not true, it's also very dangerous. And so that's why Christopher Hitchins' book is called, Why Religion Poisons Everything. And so this was the tenor of the public discussion on faith, and that was played out in all kinds of interesting ways. So in the UK, we had the Atheist Bus campaign, which was the closest thing to an advertising campaign atheism ever had here, and that was these red London buses bearing the slogan, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." And this was, just the way that the culture was at that time.
Who funded that?
So that was funded by the British Humanist Association, as was. And so that's a group of sort of secularists who want to sort of advocate for non-religion. But it was Richard Dawkins himself who really gave it a big boost when he sort of put some of his own money into it, and that got quite a lot of publicity. I mean, I've got to say though, honestly, Carey, it was an absolute gift for Christians as far as I'm concerned, because I mean, people in the UK hardly needed reminding that there's probably no God. I mean, people just weren't thinking about God, full stop. And yet here were these Red London buses putting the question right into people's eye line. And I thought, wonderful, this is Richard Dawkins by saying there's probably no God. He's actually probably making a lot more people ask the question, well, is there a God? I hadn't really thought about it, but now you mention it. And so I actually know a number of Christian leaders here in the UK who also put money into it, who funded that campaign because they thought it was a wonderful evangelistic opportunity. So there you go. And the irony of the thing is, I do know people who came to faith through Dawkins, through the new atheism. It was actually their questions and their very caustic approach to religion that actually made them stop and think and wonder whether there might be something to it, and sort of sent them in the other direction. So
kind of backfired.
Yeah, I mean, God has a sense of humor, and sometimes that it works out that way, doesn't it?
Why has the new atheism lost ground as quickly as it appears to have lost ground?
Yeah, I was really watching from the sidelines as an interested observer, because as I was hosting conversations from the mid-2000s onwards on a show called Unbelievable, I was bringing on a lot of these new atheist type characters for these quite combative discussions and debates with Christian thinkers and apologists. And that was wonderful and exciting, and I learned a lot along the way. But increasingly over the years, by the mid-2010s, I would more often have non-believers coming on the show saying, well, I'm not a Richard Dawkins kind of atheist, trying to distance themselves. And I think that's partly because a lot of even non-believers and atheists had become rather concerned at the very aggressive sloganeering form of atheism that it represented. In a way, it became quite religious. Arguably, it had its high priests, these four horsemen.
Religiously atheistic.
Yeah, exactly. As you said, evangelistic. And it was very zealous. It had its holy texts, these best-selling books. It had its gatherings, the atheist conferences that took place. And arguably science was its object of worship. And I just think more and more people started to tire of the sort of slightly more shrill and dogmatic nature of that movement. So there was that going on the one hand. People just began to tire of it. It had quite a dramatic internal implosion as well. And this is something I sketch out in some detail in my podcast series and book, which is that once the new atheists had their sort of honeymoon period, where they'd all agreed that God didn't exist and religion was bad for you, it turned out there was very little else they could agree on, because the movement began to splinter in all kinds of directions once they sort of started to try and decide what they were for. And essentially the movement sort of split into a wing that wanted to be very socially justice oriented and kind of adopted the label atheism plus. So that was atheism plus a commitment to perhaps LGBT or feminism or whatever it might be. And you had then against that a different part of the movement said, we don't want any of that. We're not here to be politically correct. We're just here for science and reason. And they went in what we would now call a quote unquote anti-woke direction. But it kind of came early, those sorts of culture wars for new atheism. And there were some very specific moments. I remember one in 2011, there was a fiasco called Elevator Gate, in which a female atheist vlogger, Rebecca Watson, gave a talk at an atheist conference in Dublin about the problem of misogyny in the atheist community as a feminist. And she then went on to have drinks later on in the evening at a bar with Richard Dawkins, who was one of the speakers there. And she ended up going back to her hotel room in the early hours of the morning. And one of the people attending the conference got in the elevator with her and essentially propositioned her, said, would you like to come back to my room for coffee? Anyway, that might have been the end of it, except that she sort of vlogged about this the following day and said, this is the problem, guys. This is exactly what I was talking about. But Richard Dawkins, when he came across this video, actually responded very sarcastically, poured scorn on the experience of this female vlogger, and sort of wrote this highly sarcastic response called "Dear Muslima," sort of parodying her concerns against that of, say, someone in Saudi Arabia or another part of the world. Anyway, this just ignited the whole debate, and as I say, everything gets appended with gate now, but elevator gate became a big sort of point of controversy in atheist circles. And really, that's when I saw the movement sort of taking these very different directions. Some people on the side of Richard Dawkins, others on the other side. And the whole thing just started to crumble to the point where literally some of these, these atheist conferences were being cancelled because the speakers weren't willing to share a stage with each other any longer. They would the ire they had towards each other was far worse than anything they meted out to their Christian counterparts. So I was sort of watching that from the sidelines, and it makes for a fascinating story. And that's partly the reason why ultimately New Atheism sort of founded and went down.
It's sort of, when leaders talk to me about church splits, I said one of the realities of church splits is if the only thing that unites you is what you're against, it's only a matter of time until the whole split unravels. Because, okay, the 8 of us all agree, or the 800 of us all agree that we don't like this, but actually we don't agree on anything else, and then, it just kind of unravels. Yeah. Were there any other reasons that you saw the new atheism sort of dissolving?
I think the biggest reason was essentially that in the end, it didn't really answer people's ultimate questions. Because science and reason are great for some things, but they don't answer life's ultimate questions. And so I think in the end, people still were carrying the same questions with them about, well, what is the purpose of life? How do I make sense of things? And I think increasingly, as the new atheist sort of promises in the literature of if we could only all adopt science and reason, we'll move into this harmonious technological scientific utopia. As that simply wasn't realized, as actually things got worse in many ways, as the culture wars progressed, as people started to, I think, experience what I would term a meaning crisis in the culture. I think I think people began to sort of just move on and realize these guys don't have the answers actually. And that's why, as I say in the book and podcast series, I really focus on the rise of a new sort of set of secular thinkers, still non-Christians, many of them, but with very different sort of ways of engaging those ultimate existential questions that people still had. And so I think it's essentially that people just didn't get the answers they actually needed from the atheists.
Today's episode is brought to you by Gloo. You know what? Easter is going to be here before you know it. Question is, are you ready? Well, if you want to reach more people and engage your congregation and make this Easter your biggest yet, you can probably use Gloo messaging. It's the free church texting tool taking the faith space by storm. With free texting on Gloo, here's what you can do. You can welcome new visitors. You can collect prayer requests. You can invite people to Easter events. And you can actually send over 10,000 free texts all at no cost to you. Texting is one of the fastest, easiest, and most effective ways to connect with people right where they are on their phones. And with Gloo messaging, you can do that all for free. So sign up today at gloo.us/messaging. That's gloo.us/messaging, and make this Easter the most impactful Easter yet. Can you give us a thumbnail of where the emerging atheist thinkers are coming from, what their paradigm is?
So by that, do you mean the new sort of thinkers who aren't part of the new atheist brigade?
The ones you just alluded to.
Well, I wouldn't want to necessarily say they're all atheists, in as much as they're perhaps not Christians, but they're quite often more open-minded to the possibility of faith. They might be agnostics. They might even term themselves seekers and so on. But these are people like Jordan Peterson, for instance, and many people will be aware of him, a Canadian psychologist who really came to public awareness in sort of 2017, 2018, partly on the back of sort of, his objections to certain aspects of politically correct culture in Canada. But really what really alerted me to him sort of was when people started sending me these lectures he was doing to packed out auditoriums, thousands of people.
And his Old Testament stuff is fascinating.
Yeah, very interesting. And here he was lecturing to all these young people on the book of Genesis for 2 or 3 hours. And you've got to ask, well, what on earth is going on? And it turned out that, yes, there was a real interest that he was tapping into among a lot of millennials and increasingly Gen Z for sort of answers about purpose and meaning and identity. And the place he was sending them to ultimately was Scripture, and saying, well, this is the book that sort of really tells us who we are and where we're coming from. Now, I could come back to him because there's lots more to say about his particular approach to the Bible, but he's just one example of this kind of this new conversation that has emerged. And someone with a huge platform, attracting thousands of people to his live talks, but also millions watching on YouTube, to his podcast and so on. And alongside him, all kinds of other interesting, similar intellectuals, again, not necessarily Christians, but very open to the value of faith. Whereas the new atheist told us religion is terrible for you, it poisons everything. That was not at all the view of these new thinkers. They were saying, actually, maybe we need something like the Christian story to make sense of life. Maybe actually the Christian story has done an awful lot more for our culture than we've given it credit for. And so an obvious example of that is Tom Holland, the historian, not the Spider-Man actor, just in case there's any confusion. But many people are by now aware of his best-selling book, Dominion, which is essentially his case, as a historian, a secular historian, for the way in which the Christian Revolution completely shaped the moral imagination of the West. And in many ways, Tom Holland's own story, I think, reflects that, because he very much grew up, as I said, earlier, in a kind of nominal Christian background where it was sort of part of his upbringing, but he never really, invested that much into it. He was a sort of agnostic, really, by the time his teenage years came around. And he was a happy sort of agnostic, making a living from writing popular historical works on the Greco-Roman world into his adult years. But what he says is that the longer he spent time in the sandals, if you like, of the Greeks and the Romans, the more he realized how very alien their world was to his, especially when it came to their values, because this was a world where slavery was just a de facto part of the economy, where the lives of women and children were very cheap, where some people could be the sexual property of other people. A Roman male could have access to whoever was essentially his social inferior, and all kinds of other ways in which he recognized that the values they held to were completely alien to his own belief in equality and human rights, dignity, freedom, progress, compassion. And he wondered, well, where did that come from? And he realized, I didn't get it from science or atheism. Those are sort of value neutral projects, really. He realized he didn't get it from the Greeks or the Romans, obviously. He realized he got them from Jesus Christ and the movement that began in his name. And so the way he put it to me, and I've had the privilege of interviewing quite a number of times over the last few years, he said, I struggle to believe in Christianity, Justin, but I recognize that in almost every other way, I am a Christian because I've been so shaped by the Christian culture that essentially handed us the West. So, and again, huge following. He co-hosts the most popular history podcast in the world now. The rest is history. And it's so fascinating to see these very influential, agnostic characters, intellectuals, but very open to the value of Christianity, suddenly coming on the scene. And I could mention many more besides.
Yeah. No, the two that you picked are really interesting choices, because I think there's a lot of people listening to the show who would say, well, wait a minute, I thought Jordan Peterson and Tom Holland were ours, like they were part of the Christian milieu, or at least they are people who Christians are open to learning and listening from. But Jordan Peterson, unless I'm out of date, famously has not declared his position spiritually. It's a question he will not answer, even though his whole new book is about the Bible, from what I understand. And Tom Holland is, he's a little bit at the end of Dominion about his own spiritual journey, but he's sort of on the fence. So you would consider them to be like agnostic / open / I don't like labels, but I'm curious.
I'm not here to sort of say exactly where they are. Obviously, that's ultimately between them and God. I would say, interestingly, Tom Holland, even in the time that I've known him and have been interviewing him, he has gone and on something of a spiritual journey as well as this intellectual one. And and this is no secret. He the last time I did a public conversation with him in London, he talked actually quite candidly about some experiences he'd had, which had really made him sort of really brought him to the edge of faith. And he does now go to church quite regularly. And he will often say to me, look, if you ask me at Easter, do you believe in God and Christianity? I'll say, absolutely, I do. And sometimes it's about the environment I'm in. But actually, I think there is I'd say if I had to sort of, call it one way or the other, I'd say Tom Holland is essentially wants to believe and often does believe. He's in that sort of Lord, I believe, help my unbelief kind of phase. I would say. Jordan Peterson, it's hard. As I said earlier, he takes a very psychological, especially Jungian approach to scripture, and for him, that is the way in which that's the interpretive lens he puts on the Bible, and it's led a lot of people to ask, I think, quite legitimately, well, is this just is it sort of symbolism all the way down as far as he's concerned when it comes to the Bible? And the real question is, did Jesus rise from the dead? Is that is that a fact of history, or is it a very helpful psychological concept, if you like? And that's the ultimate question. What's interesting is that there's certainly many people around Jordan Peterson who have answered in the affirmative to the historical reality of Christianity, not least his wife, Tammy Peterson, who's become a very devout Catholic now. His daughter, Michaela, has become a Christian. And he surrounds himself with lots of Christian thinkers, people like Bishop Robert Barron, the well-known Catholic bishop, Jonathan Pajot, well-known Orthodox thinker, and many others. And so it feels like the net is certainly sort of closing in to that extent. I just don't know. I don't know what it is ultimately that may finally bring him across the line, if you like. I think there's still a battle possibly going on there in terms of submitting to something that is ultimately about more than the intellect, that transcends the intellect in that sense. So I don't know exactly where he is. What I will say, Carey, is those are just two examples, and there's a whole spectrum here. Yeah. And there's people who are very much on the arguably a slightly more cynical end of the spectrum, where they can see the value of Christianity, they're glad it's there, but they have no interest in believing in it themselves. They are the quote unquote cultural Christians. And even Richard Dawkins has said words to that effect in recent months.
Well, and what a difference 15 years makes. I mean, from evangelical atheists topping the bestseller list to people like Peterson and Holland topping the bestseller list, and a fundamentally more sympathetic, open view to Christianity, which I think is your point, right? Which is fascinating. But what I'm interested in, I mean, one of the things I loved about preaching for decades, and I'm not preaching as much anymore, once or twice a year, that's it, just dabbling once in a while. But it's time for another generation. So, but one of the things I always loved was when unchurched people were in the room, and I would always try to convince the skeptic. And sometimes people were just skeptical because, we're kind of pre-Christian culture in Canada. They didn't know, or the whole resurrection thing, or I don't know, my grandmother was Anglican. I didn't like it. I hated church growing up, or I grew up Catholic or Presbyterian or evangelical, or I don't like the Christians I read about in the headlines. So there was always, in my mind, a battle going on. And, I was trained in law, and, one of the strategies you have to have is don't give the worst argument of your enemy. Find the best argument of the opposing counsel. The thing, and I'm wondering, because you've literally conducted hundreds of interviews with atheists, what in your mind as a Christian are the best arguments the atheists have?
Oh, that's a great question. The interesting thing is, as I've engaged a lot of the arguments for and against Christianity over the years, I think, in all honesty, there are more arguments for God than against. If you simply were to tally up the numbers, if you look
kind of where I landed too. But I'm interested. I mean, it's not like the atheists are brainless, right? Like
no,
they have
absolutely.
great views.
And what I would say is, even though there are less arguments for atheism, actually there are some pretty powerful arguments nonetheless. Ones that and the most obvious one is the problem of suffering and evil. That's the one that so many conversations ultimately came round to in one form or another. And the objection to God, which is arguably just takes different forms in other arguments. So another argument from atheism that I have found, personally challenging is the God's hiddenness. Why, if there is a God, why does he seem to play hide and seek with us? Why not just make his his presence and existence more obvious. But again, that in a way is a version of the problem of evil. If God is good, why does he not, actually show his existence more, in a more direct way, and so on. So ultimately, I think a lot of the arguments for atheism do come back to what is the oldest question of all. Why is there evil and suffering in the world? And it's a question the Bible deals with all the time, and its oldest book, Job, deals with. So I would say that's probably the one that I have gone over the most with atheists at various points. And there are no easy answers. Obviously, there are some apologetic approaches that may be helpful, but inevitably, it's a question that is far more than just a logical question. It's a very emotional question as well.
As a famous apologist once says, when somebody asked, about pain and suffering, he's like, well, tell me your story. And inevitably, it's not an intellectual question. It's about a parent who died, or a sibling, or a spouse, or a child. It's always personal. One of the questions I get quite a bit, particularly from next gen, like under 35s, is hell. People just really struggle with the concept of hell. What arguments do you hear surrounding, separation of good and evil in eternity?
Honestly, I hear less about this now than I used to, interestingly, and it may partly be because churches are not majoring on hell so much, so it's not as much.
It doesn't come up a lot in the dialogue.
Yeah, and so maybe that's why I don't hear that objection so often. But of course, where I do hear it, interestingly, is often from people who have perhaps lost their faith, ex-Christians, people who've deconstructed, and very frequently they are frequently the ones who have a problem with the concept of hell. And frankly, I have some problems with some instantiations of hell that are given in some parts of the church, because actually I think it can appear very unjust, and it can look like gratuitous sort of, a gratuitous punishment that doesn't seem to fit the crime, if you like. So I think we need to take that very seriously. I mean, where I would begin with anyone asking that question is, well, what do you mean by hell? Because I think very often people have picked up an image of hell that is actually not a biblical one. It's got more in common with medieval images of torture chambers and devils with red hot pokers and things. And so the first thing you might want to do is to just simply interrogate what the person themselves believes, or has in their head that Christians or Christian theology teaches about hell. And then I'd want to also talk about heaven, because that's sort of the other side of the coin, if you like. And again, a lot of people have some idea of a retirement home where you play heavenly golf forever or something like that. And again, I'd want to question that sort of version, because in a sense, for me, the reason we need to talk about both heaven and hell is because heaven, if it's anything, is the kingdom of God. And the thing about a kingdom is it has a king. And I've met many non-Christians who actually, I think in the end, if push came to shove, wouldn't necessarily want to live in that kingdom, who would say, actually, I'd rather carry on in my own power, my own strength. I'm not really looking for someone to be a king over me. That's obviously in the end a highly personal thing. It's something that you don't often get to, that kind of level of seeing into someone in the course of having a sort of a 1-hour conversation with them necessarily. But ultimately, I think that's where the buck stops for some people. And I think I can think of, for instance, some very honest passages from atheists like Thomas Nagel, who have said, well, look, if I'm completely honest, I don't want Christianity to be true. I don't want the universe to be like that. And I think even Christopher Hitchins, when I've heard him sort of railing against God, he often rails against this sort of cartoon version of God, this North Korean dictator version of God. But I've often wondered, well, if you were face to face with God himself, Christopher, would you want that God? Or would that just be another sort of threat to your autonomy at some level? So I think thinking about it in that way helps then to frame, well, what is hell? Ultimately, I think hell, looking at the picture language that's used in Scripture and in the New Testament especially, I think it's ultimately a separation from God. It's choosing not to have God. And in that sense, as C.S. Lewis said, the doors of hell are locked from the inside. And I think that, for me, is perhaps a more helpful framing of the whole issue for people who are perhaps wondering where the justice is and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
to say,
The Great
well, actually,
Divorce,
yeah,
C.S.
yeah,
Lewis, really
absolutely.
helpful framing.
Yeah,
And I echo you. Anybody who thinks hell is a great idea probably has some issues that need to be unpacked.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know that you can be excited about that idea as a Christian, even if you accept it, that there will be some kind of separation eternally. So, you're on both sides. Well, I mean, you're a Christian who interviews and sets up debates. There are tens of thousands of preachers listening, watching this, and they're engaged with churched and unchurched people on a regular basis. I would love for you, based on your experience, to identify, if you can, the top 3 patterns you've observed in people who successfully seem to navigate conversations between Christianity and secular worldviews. Like, what are some of the best practices that the people who are really good at this, and feel free, not to be immodest, but to draw from your own experience. Hey, on my good days, when I'm doing this, these conversations tend to go really well, and maybe someone even changes their mind. What are some of those best practices?
I think, at the risk of these being very obvious, one of the most obvious is that listening is absolutely critical. I think so often we go into conversations in this area with a sort of a list of arguments and objections that we're going to make. And we're just really waiting for the other person to finish speaking so we can say the next thing we sort of have planned. And actually, I think conversations like that don't go very well. I think people can tell when you're not really taking them seriously, when you're not really listening. So I think we need to practice really listening. And some of the best people who do that bridging between the Christian and non-Christian world are really good listeners. They really hear and sort of feed back to the person what they've heard. They want to make sure that they've represented them correctly, that they've understood them correctly. I mean, I can think of Sean McDowell is a wonderful example of this. Sean is the son of Josh McDowell, himself a well-known apologist, but Sean has really developed a wonderful ministry of his own online, on YouTube and elsewhere, not only kind of teaching apologetics, but also really doing really good engagement with non-Christians on his channel. And I just always point to him as a wonderful example of how to do listening really well and sort of make sure that person feels heard and feels that you've actually understood and are putting their argument back to them. And that in itself is another principle, I think, that can be really helpful. The idea of, it's sometimes called steel manning the other person's argument, but I think it's really just about reflecting that you're not here to knock down a straw man, and that if you can actually put that person's point of view back to them as well as they could express it themselves, then I think you've given them the confidence to know that actually you're taking them seriously. And so I think that's another really important thing that we could do as Christian communicators, is to really understand the other person's argument and to be able to reflect it back to them, and only start to critique it once they're happy that you've really understood it in that way. So that's something I've tried to do myself sometimes in conversation. And very often, when I'm in the conversation, I'm the moderator. I'm sort of trying to make sure both parties have equal say, that both parties, feel that they've been adequately represented. But one of the things I was able to do at various points in that was to kind of do that thing of representing the argument to the other person. So if the Christian has, made a fairly long point on their side, I could sort of take that and just package it up in a way that's helpful for both the non-Christian and the listeners as well, and likewise in the other direction. And I think it's always the hospitality of making people feel like they're being heard in that way. And I can't overstate how important that is for there to be any fruit in the end in a conversation. You can set up these things purely as a sort of bombastic debate, a kind of point scoring exercise. And there's a place for, that kind of drama in certain settings. But I think ultimately very, very few people change their mind in those kinds of settings where you're really just sort of taking your positions and sort of firing volleys over the wall. What I've really enjoyed when I've hosted conversations where I really feel people have actually connected on a personal level, and the conversation continues after we shut off the mics, and they, and friendships develop, and that's where you really see the fruit come through. So for me, it's about not playing into something that's so easy to do in our online social media echo chamber culture, where you can simply essentially just echo the same platitudes or points of view that people on your side already believe, and you're not willing to sit down and really listen and take notice of someone. And that's a game changer for me. And very often that can only really be done in person. It's very hard to replicate that in an online setting. Facebook, Twitter, those places, they're just not good places in the end, I think, to do religious dialogue. They usually go badly when you try it there, because you just don't have all the things you normally have in a human conversation in that kind of setting.
You started your answer by saying, I don't want to say the things that are obvious. From my perspective, they're not obvious at all, because I think a lot of apologetics is still, I'm going to show you exactly why you're wrong. Here are 5 reasons. And what you're really doing in that setting is you're preaching to the choir. You're giving more ammunition to combative Christians, and they're going to feel self-righteous and self-justified. But what you're describing, having a dialogue where you really listen to other people, you can empathize with it, you can give them their best argument back to them in a way that they would agree with it, to say, oh, you really have understood, Justin, I think is an extremely difficult skill set. And I think if more pastors had it, we might see different high conversion churches emerge in the U.S. Now, that said, the Brits, I have someone close to me who has from England, and I'm like, you automatically get 10 points in IQ right there, just for having a British accent. But
it's very unfair.
Yeah, it is very unfair. One thing I really appreciate, I'm a big Alpha fan. We've run it for years at our church. There is something, I don't know whether it's the British demeanor or what it is, the culture that was created at HTB, Holy Trinity Brompton, or what it is. But there is a genuine respect and curiosity that appears to be transcultural. Alpha's working in the UK, around the world, in the United States, in Canada, in the Commonwealth, and beyond. That is very compelling. It takes hardened atheists, people from different worldviews and religions, and honors them. And in the process, many, many, many become followers of Jesus. I guess there's a question under that, Justin, about disposition, because so much of apologetics, you mentioned the classic definition, correct in Greek, is defense, but it makes us defensive. Do you know what I mean? That's not what I pick up in your work. That is not what I hear you saying. So I'm wondering if you have any tutelage or coaching for leaders on the tone and the culture, the tone they set, the culture they create, the atmosphere that they foster when having those conversations.
Well, I think it's great that you mentioned Alpha, and we've run many Alpha courses at our church, and it has simply been the most successful evangelistic, course.
Yeah, if we had a better one, we'd go with it. We've never found a better one. Period.
Exactly. But the key to the Alpha course, actually, I think, is actually the way it happens, and that is essentially it's centered around a meal, around people getting to know each other, and then that leads into the talk and then the discussion and everything else. And it's over the course of developing relationships that people really start to trust and to open up and to talk at a much more honest level about, sometimes there are intellectual issues that are on the table, but very often you get beyond those to emotional issues, to the sort of the story of the people who are sitting around the table or whatever. And I think that's, again, that's something, it's very hard to do outside of that face-to-face human level. And for me, that's really important. Church has this extraordinary advantage over most other things that are on offer at the moment in our culture, which is that it's still face-to-face. It's about genuine human community. And I think that is an extraordinary thing, and we should play into that as far as possible. So I would want to encourage, that there is a place for, that more, as I say, intellectual apologetics. And Alpha does a bit of that along the way. It helps people to see why they might have good reason to believe that the Bible is reliable, and why it might make sense to believe in God and so on. But ultimately, I think it rightly recognizes that people are not just brains on legs, that they're looking for a relationship. They're looking for a sense of belonging. And ultimately, a lot of the objections that are presented can often can often be more of a smokescreen, if I'm honest, for more emotional reasons why people ultimately reject faith. And when you get to those, and you probably only get to those sort of on week 5 or 6 or something of the Alpha course, that's when I think you really start to see this fruit happening. And so for me, that's important. And I think church leaders absolutely need to recognize that, need to recognize that ultimately we're dealing with people who are, body, mind, and soul. And we shouldn't ignore the mind, because for a lot of people, they will need that intellectual approach and working things out. But actually, as I said earlier, most people actually intuit things more than work them out on a purely rational level. And people can soon sense whether what you're offering is the real thing or not. And so that's why you have to bring it within the context of the church community. You've got to kind of lay it out there. This is what we're offering. We're offering this life in all its fullness. You'll soon be able to tell whether it's the real deal or not by the way we're treating each other, the way we're treating you, the way we're carrying on this whole relationship. So for me, all of that is hugely important and makes a big difference.
I think you're right. People know over a meal and over face-to-face contact whether they are loved, whether they're accepted, or whether they're being quietly judged. And I think that's a big issue. Boy, time has flown. Couple more questions. I think you've got a section on this in the book where you talk about the absolute flood of information we're getting now, right? Apologetics 25 years ago, you had to buy a book or go onto some chat forum on dial-up. Now, information's everywhere. You can get lost in the YouTube rabbit hole, et cetera, et cetera. Any clues as to how to cut through the noise and really connect with meaning, wisdom, eternal things when people are confronted minute by minute with a deluge of more information than they can possibly consume?
Yeah, I think that is what we're competing with. And very often, I don't think what people need necessarily is just more content. And that's sometimes the danger of the church, is just sort of delivering them yet another video or podcast or whatever. I create that stuff, so in a sense, I'm the worst offender here. But the
Same.
I suppose what the church needs to do is to remind people of the depth that's there. What we're really overwhelmed with now is a lot of shallow media, I think, and I think we're all aware of that when it comes to the shortening attention spans that we have, when it comes to our online consumption and everything else. And the danger is, I suppose, that the church can sometimes play into that, or can sort of go along with that to the extent that we end up just sort of sounding or representing things that are as shallow as the rest of the sort of consumerist mentality that's already on offer. And I don't think people just need more noise at this point. I think they need to be. I think what people are looking for is a kind of a depth. So it's interesting that while you've got the sort of the rise of this very short form, attention grabbing, clickbait media, you've also got people wanting these 3-hour long Joe Rogan type conversations on podcast. I've noticed a lot of people gravitating towards quite serious things, quite challenging things. And I think that we need to be aware that it would be a mistake to simply try and capture that sort of very surface level, shallow kind of way of engaging people, when actually probably the greatest fruit to be reaped, in a sense, is the people who are looking for the deeper things. And that's where I've sort of been trying to put my efforts when it comes to the media I produce, is to kind of give a bit of a deeper understanding of what's going on in our culture, and invite people into something that is not just more information, but is actually inviting them to a community, to a pattern of living that makes a difference. And this is why I'm so glad to see more and more Christians, I think, becoming aware that we don't just need another program. We need something that actually people will go and do, a community that they will become part of, that they will actually start praying rather than just being fed, however many videos on the art of praying or whatever it is. And for me, that's the absolutely essential thing, because people are desperate, I think, to find something meaningful again in a meaning crisis. And that information overload, I think, is part of the problem. Is that we've been given so many options now. There are so many stories on offer about how you can live your life, about the different ways in which we could do that. That people, it's come into a world where there was once an overarching story, a narrative that by and large did make sense of people's lives, the Christian story. But as that sort of got swept aside for all the reasons we mentioned earlier, it's not been replaced by this sort of oasis of science and reason. It's actually been replaced by all kinds of other quasi-religious stories. And we are drowning in them now. And there's stories on the left around maybe sexuality and gender and identity politics that may become people's new kind of story that they use to make sense of their life. It might be sort of political mythologies on the right that suddenly take the place of the God story. But the point is, we're all sort of, I think we're all burned out by these culture wars that this creates, especially younger people. And I think, again, the reason that, as you've got a Gen Z sort of, essentially addicted to smartphones and these rising rates of mental health problems and so on, it's all part of this wider meaning crisis. And the church, therefore, has to somehow offer something that is better than that. And I can't think of it. And I think that's why we're seeing an openness, this new openness that I've mentioned already, to the value of faith again, to the value of the Christian story. Some of these intellectuals, influencers online who are starting to take that seriously and present it to their audiences again, because they're seeing the meaning crisis. And they can see that simply pumping more information, more technology, more science, more politics into it is not going to help anybody. And so they're inviting them back into to actually a story. And the challenge for the church is how to take what some of these prophets from outside the church are pointing people towards and saying, now step inside. Don't just look at it in theory. Don't just listen to a podcast or watch a video channel. Try church for real. Try and see whether this actually may do something that gives you a completely different perspective on how to live life. And for me, that's the great challenge of the church, to step up in an age when people, I think, are ready to hear the story again, because the other stories they've been told have just, have become so thin, superficial, shallow, that they're ready for something bigger and better.
It's actually very refreshing to hear, because I think the temptation when you're leading a church can be, I got to get shorter, shallower, more soundbitey. And I agree with you that taking the road less traveled, going deeper, doing the hard work, listening, embracing, having longer, meaningful dialogues. You're right. I mean, we live in the era of TikTok and Joe Rogan, the era of Reels and Jordan Peterson. And the two seem diametrically opposed, or like the longer content is outdated. But actually, when you really look at engagement, no, the longer stuff really does resonate if it's good. If it's good.
Yeah.
And man, the church should be able to do that extremely well. Right? Really.
Absolutely.
Justin, I got to a fraction of my questions. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you would like to mention? And we'll point to the book and everything, but anything topically that we haven't touched on that you think is of note?
I was only going to mention, we've talked about some of these interesting intellectuals, prophets from outside the church, pointing people back to the value of religion as new atheism has waned. And I think there are some people, as I say, who are using it for sort of political ends. They want Christian culture, but they don't necessarily want Jesus. But it's interesting because I think there is a real spectrum here. And what I'm really excited by is to see people who are also jumping in with both feet, not just sort of agnostics, tentatively on the edge of church, but people, adult converts who I'm increasingly meeting today, who have found that actually the Christian story has made sense of their life. And I'm thinking of people like celebrated author and poet here in the UK, Paul Kingsnorth, who has an extraordinary following as a poet and author, and just a few years ago announced his adult conversion to Christianity, coming into the Eastern Orthodox stream. And I see him, I see Ayaan Hirsi Ali, arguably the most famous female atheist in the world, announcing her conversion just over a year ago. And again, I sense that something is happening. It's not just that people are talking in different ways, but actually I'm seeing some quite extraordinary examples of people taking the plunge as well. So I just want to, I suppose, encourage any church leader listening. We can often get quite cynical about the state of the church and about the state of culture, and there's often very good reason to be. But I think God is always doing something new, and I think there are actually some really interesting opportunities opening up. And we just need to try and be faithful in if there is a sort of, if that sea of faith that I talked about at the beginning has gone out a long way, well, it could come back in again. And that's the point of tides, And I just think the church needs to be ready for the fact that we might be seeing the turning of that tide at the moment, and people ready to hear the story again.
I would love nothing more than for that to be the case, Justin. Well, the book is called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief. It's available everywhere. Tell us more about where people can find you online these days. Justin, what are you up to?
Well, you can find me on YouTube. There's a channel called Justin Brierley. My podcast series it's been great to engage with a lot of new listeners that way. It's also called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. So that's another place you can find me. I'm on social media, Twitter, Instagram, all the usual places. But if you want links to all of that, plus the book, plus the podcast, my website is simply justinbrierley.com.
Well, I've really appreciated your work, your interviews, the great work that you're doing on behalf of all of us. Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing with us today, Justin.
Been an absolute pleasure, Carey. Thank you.